It's going to be a lot easier if we have some partners. So if you're in a row with somebody, but you're a few seats apart, can y'all squish together, please? And once you do that, take a chance to introduce yourselves and then ask them what their experience is with JavaScript and just WordPress in general. Okay. Cool. Okay, so is there any group or pairing of people who are both completely new? Y'all have never coded JavaScript before today. Any of y'all around? Okay. My dear friends, make sure that you are sitting next to somebody who has done a little bit of JavaScript. It is going to help a ton. So if you're in an island where you're both completely new, pull somebody else next to you, look at the row behind you or in front of you, and swap your seat real quick.
So someone was asking, like, when they go to this URL, it's just like a preview file that they're rather download or supposed to be.
Uh-oh, hold on. That means that my push didn't go through. Hold on, let me try that again. Let's see if my phone would even be faster. Having trouble with the Wi-Fi here. Sorry about that, y'all. Somebody just pointed out that my push of all the files did not go through, so you're going to need to download that very unhelpful zip file with one README in it one more time in 1 second here. I'm just trying to, that's JavaScript, and then we're done, right? Just open this file and we're finished. Okay, now y'all got something to download. Try that again, por favor. So these are the tools that we're going to be using today. Again, once you re-download that link, you'll have all the slides, which will be helpful because sometimes you'll start practicing something that we've been looking at, and you'll want to have that reference. Again, I'm using Atom, big fan. You don't need to be using it. Any code editor will work. And then we're going to be looking at some Json requests from the WordPress REST API, which are going to look like a big blob of confusing text unless you install this Chrome extension. There are alternatives for other browsers, but I'm going to be working in Chrome. I suggest you do too, at least for today. So JSON View Chrome extension, you want to install that. And then again, WordPress local setup. And there's a cool plugin called FakerPress that allows you to create like 15 blog posts really quick, and then that'll help with us playing around with the WordPress REST API. We won't use any of this for a little bit. We're going to talk through and look at some examples of code together. So, if you have any trouble, we also have some TAs. Where are our helpers here today? Corey, Will, and Gabe. If you can't get help from the person next to you, give them a holler, and they'll come over and help. Okay, so let's preface this whole thing here with a lot of us have heard the phrase that we need to learn JavaScript deeply, right? Is anybody here in connection with hearing that? Anybody here just because you know that JavaScript is something that you do want to learn more and you haven't heard that phrase? Okay. In the WordPress community, there has been a lot of push to encourage people to learn JavaScript deeply. And the reason is because one, JavaScript can be a tricky language, as we'll see here. It's quite different from other languages, and it interacts with the browser in a different way than a lot of other languages do. But also, more of WordPress core itself is beginning to be built out in JavaScript. So we're at a time where JavaScript can take a few years, honestly, to learn deeply. So if you're in that process now, this is a good time to be doing that. However, not everybody needs to learn JavaScript deeply. If you're a website owner and you just hear that JavaScript can allow you to do some complex things, as you'll hear me say a lot today, you need to know this much JavaScript to do this much with it. Whereas with CSS, you can learn this much and do this much. So if you're in a position where you're a website owner, you're not necessarily coding, you do not need to worry about learning JavaScript. Your developer will do that for you. If you're someone who has picked up maybe a little bit of CSS and you like the power of it, and you want to explore JavaScript to make things more interactive, just be ready for a longer learning curve. Because unlike HTML and CSS, which are presentation languages, this is an actual programming language. So it has a lot more logic and other things with it. So hopefully we're all here still in the right place. If this becomes overwhelming, we're going to be here a couple hours. We'll take no offense. If you get up and walk out, your brain starts to be affected by JavaScript at a certain point. So we're expecting that. Again, the tools we have. And let's go ahead and look at the workshop for today. So the first part of the workshop is going to be just about JavaScript. And by the first part, it'll kind of be like more than half of the time we allocate to it, because we're going to try to cover everything about the JavaScript language that you would learn in a normal JavaScript college course, as well as the document object model and working with events. Oh, I realized I didn't even introduce myself. Sorry about this. Hi, my name is Zach. My background is in education. I started off teaching web development and WordPress and stuff at high school, then went on to teach at colleges. Then I went to teach at this really cool online learning site called Treehouse. Anybody heard of Treehouse? Y'all have an account? Sweet, love that place. Seen any of their WordPress stuff before? Yeah, it's me with shorter hair and no facial hair. But then Treehouse stopped teaching WordPress. Ironically, the exact same week that Matt Mullenweg was like, go learn JavaScript deeply. So I'm like, I'm out of a job. I think I'll go teach this instead. And since then, I've been running this JavaScript for WordPress master course that goes in depth into teaching JavaScript and then the WordPress REST API and all of that. So this workshop is kind of a 3-hour sneak peek into like 100 hours of content, right, that would take you a year to complete. So we're going to pack all that into like the first hour and a half or so, right? No problem. Then we'll go on and talk about the WordPress REST API, which really is super simple. It's like this much of the workshop. We just look at how to make the page requests, and that's pretty much it. Then we can move back into the JavaScript. But there are some things about how we access it and how we could customize the request to get something different back that is important to understand. So once we do all that, we're going to be doing all of this outside of WordPress. We're going to just do it in a plain HTML file that could be hosted on any site, run JavaScript, and pull in WordPress content. Once we have all that working and we understand the mechanics, then we'll take that and drop it into a WordPress theme and look at some of the things that are specific to doing JavaScript within WordPress itself that are different, because there are some differences. So that will hopefully be what we cover today. There's a good chance that there will be homework after it. And anytime that you see this little icon at the bottom with the video and it says, check out free 5 days of JavaScript, this is on that initial page you saw to download the files. If you scroll to the bottom, I have this little drip campaign for the next 5 days where you'll get like something like 4 or 5 hours of content. And all the stuff that we can't explain in depth here are like there are in-depth videos about that. So when you see that icon, I'll mention, oh, go check these out for more details on all this, because we don't really have time to cover it. Because really what I've tried to do, and this is maybe like my 10th or 11th time this year giving this workshop, and you're lucky to have it at the end of the year because, whoa, it's gotten better, is try to figure out how do we take like so much about JavaScript, right? You have to do so much to do so little, and condense that down and really pick out like what are the core things about it and what are the core misunderstandings that people have that we want to knock out of the way at the beginning. So we're going to start off with a pop quiz. Pair it with your partner, And here's how this is going to work. You're basically going to get 1 point for being able to answer the question using your words. Then you're going to get another point if you can code out an example. And for everybody who gets like a certain number of points, we have tons of these Learn Deeply stickers and some JavaScript wapoos and cool stuff like that. Now, of course, I realize like you're in a workshop for JavaScript, so you might not know the answers, but you might also be surprised with the help of a partner how much you do already know. And then I'll go over all the answers, and at the end of the workshop, if you think you can then answer all the questions, come and get stickers anyways, right? Because we accomplish what we want to. OK, y'all ready? OK. Nobody said yes. First question, pairing up with a partner, what is a variable? One of you try to explain in words, if you understand what it is, what a variable is. Another one of you, or maybe the same one, try to code out an example of a variable in JavaScript. If you're sitting there and not knowing anything, then look at the people behind you or the row in front of you and see if they could maybe help with the dialogue. OK, next question. What is an array? OK, next question. What is a function? Try to define that clearly in one small sentence. Halfway there. What is an object? What is a loop? And what is a conditional? We're now like 3/4 of the way through a college course right now on learning any language. How do you include JavaScript in HTML? There are 3 answers that get progressively better. All right, and now the bonus question. How do you include JavaScript in a WordPress theme? I don't expect you to code out the full answer, but maybe you could explain your way there. All right, so we had 8 questions here. And as I said, anytime you learn any programming language, you're pretty much going to learn all first of these 6 questions. And I'll go over the answers in a moment, so don't feel bad if we didn't get them all. But how many folks with you and your partner got 16 out of 16? All right. Okay, go enjoy another talk, and see you later. How many got like 10 out of 16? 5? Yeah? Was there anybody who didn't get any? You don't raise your hand, it's okay. We're gonna learn all these things, starting with the first one. So a variable is a container for storing values. And the most important thing to remember in JavaScript is that this exists in memory, and the memory exists in your browser. So anytime you refresh your browser, you're going to lose everything in memory, and it starts over. This is why eventually some integration with a database is important so that we could save those values somewhere. Now, there are 3 different types of variables in JavaScript. We have var, which is the longest standing way of creating a variable, stands for var. And then we have let and const, which were introduced more recently into the JavaScript language. So we don't really have the time to go into the differences, but this is basically the difference between them. However, we have to understand things like scope in JavaScript, which is a quite complex topic, and then the ability of, or the difference between immutability and immutable binding and things like that for that last row there. So my suggestion is use var until you understand the differences between these. The direction you see in JavaScript right now is all the cool kids are saying use const for everything and then use let as a backup and then use var, basically deprecate that, don't use it anymore. And the reason for this comes out of other people coming from other languages where var, let, and const do different things, coming into JavaScript and being like WTF. And it's not the only thing they're saying that about in JavaScript. But one of them just starts with the variables, because these and other programming languages, if you're coming from a C background, anybody code another language besides JavaScript? Right? Okay, so this is pretty common. These behave differently. So the JavaScript community is trying to say, oh, well, let's try to make JavaScript as familiar for other people coming into it. And I think that's kind of ridiculous. I think you should not use these until you understand them. But guess what? In that 5 free days of JavaScript, you get a good video explaining it all. OK, so the other cool thing about variables is that you can assign them all in a bunch together. So notice I have commas here separating and then a semicolon at the end. Semicolon should come at the end of every statement in JavaScript. You technically don't need them because as JavaScript is being compiled, the compiler will add them in for you. However, it won't add them in everywhere, so there are some instances where you need them and some where you don't, and in that kind of situation, I just say always use them until you know when not to, right? But the other thing that you'll see here is a block of variables being assigned, and then this goes at the top of our code. So at the top of any block of code in JavaScript, you should expect to see all of the things that might change throughout that file or that page or that set of code. And this is a very common practice, although there are a few people that say redeclare them or throw them anywhere that makes sense, but let's not do that. So an array then is a collection of values or a collection of variables, if you will. And this is what an example of an array looks like. You have square brackets and then everything that you want to put inside of it. And so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, comma separated, and then we have this other example. And this is to point out in JavaScript that sometimes you could have line breaks in your code, and sometimes you can't. And so arrays is one of those places where if you're putting in a bunch of really long stuff into a collection, then you might want to break it down into separate lines, separated by commas, and that's completely valid JavaScript. But notice still, again, the semicolons at the end. When anybody was talking about arrays, did you bring up the fact that they are 0 indexed? Did anybody mention that as part of it? OK, so 0 indexed means that when we start counting the number of items in an array, like let's say we want to get the first item, instead of saying give me item number 1, we're going to say give me item number 0. That's all that it means. Some programming languages are 0 indexed, some are 1 indexed. And the weird thing about JavaScript is it's 0 indexed in 99% of JavaScript, and there's one place where it's like randomly 1 index, and it's kind of like, what? We're not even going to talk about it. That's not even in the 5 free days, right? That's just kind of a little tidbit. So what that means, though, is that if we want to get values, so if I said, give me the first value, I want to get post ID number 1, we would get that by passing in post IDs, the square brackets, and then 0. There's this little trick here if you ever want to get the last item in an array. So JavaScript is an object-oriented language, meaning that everything in it literally is an object. And so you could take an object like this post IDs array, and you could say, give me the length of it by doing dot length. But the problem is like, this is going to give us back the length of 4. But if I tried to say, give me post ID 4, it's going to actually think it's the 5th one because it's 0 index, so you have to subtract 1 from the length. And this is a weird thing about like 0 index languages and just something to keep in mind. Functions are a level up from there, and they let us write, call, and reuse blocks of code. This is an example of what a function looks like in JavaScript. So we use the keyword function. We give our function a name most of the time, parentheses, curly braces, and then inside of there we could do whatever we want. Now anytime you have a function, it's automatically going to return back a value to whatever called it. Now you could specify it to give a value, like in this case I'm going to do some magical API stuff, go get my posts, and then return them back. So if I called get posts, I would get a value back. If you don't specify the return, then it'll just return true false, like hey, this executed, and give you a 0 or a 1 or something like that. Now there are a few different ways that we could refer to functions. This is called the function declaration. And this we set up on its own, but it will never execute in our code. It'll just sit there as a little isolated block of code. And it's not until we call our function, so this is what's referred to as a function call. I'm going to come over here. And this will execute this. And we could call this 100 times in our code. So all over the place, we could say, hey, use this code over here, use this code over here, use this code over here. But there are sometimes in JavaScript, and a lot of programming language, particularly when working with the DOM, is that you want to refer to a function, but you don't want it to be called. Like an example is, hey, when somebody clicks on this link, go ahead and execute this function. But in our code, if we just called that function there, it would be reading, reader would say, if click on this link, oh, I need to execute this immediately, and then it would never wait for that link to be clicked. So if we have a function without the parentheses at the end, then this is referred to as a function reference, and it doesn't get executed. It just waits to be called later on, and we'll see that come up again. When y'all were talking about functions, did anybody mention parameters? Yeah, that guy, all right. And that guy, sweet, good partners for calling them out, thank you. Functions would not be able to do much, and programming in general, right, would not do much if it couldn't receive value in and then give it back out. Otherwise, everything would be static and you wouldn't have anything that's dynamic. So functions are also allowed to take in values. And one of the cool things about JavaScript lately is that it added the ability to set default parameters. So if you've worked with PHP, PHP has had this for a long time in the language. JavaScript does now too. So what this is going to say is when you call getUser, I'm going to set the default value of user ID equals 0, but maybe you could pass in a new value and I'll use that instead. And then I'm going to do my API magic, get my user ID, and then pass it back. So when I call getUser in this instance, I want to specify what user I'm looking for, and this kind of code a lot. There's also this thing called fat arrow functions. So believe it or not, that's not right. This is basically the same as this in one line. So what we get with fat arrow functions is the ability to not use the word function. So rather than say function get posts, we're just saying get posts. And then rather than have to put the parentheses and curly braces, this value here is our parameter, and this is going to be returned to us. This is another thing I would not suggest you start using until you really understand, because fat arrow functions do some things that normal functions don't, and they don't do some things that normal functions do. So just because this is a cool new way of writing them, don't implement them until you fully understand how they work. But we'll see some, and I'll show you, I'll show you a few examples of where they are a good idea. One of the funniest things you could say about JavaScript is like, oh, I want to learn object-oriented JavaScript, because JavaScript is completely object-oriented in that everything in it technically is an object. Often what times people mean by that is I want to learn class-based programming, which JavaScript does not have. Even though we have a keyword class, classical inheritance does not exist in JavaScript. We have something called prototypal inheritance. So again, JavaScript does a lot of things to make other programming languages seem like it's doing something similar. But an object is basically a variable that has its own variables and its own functions attached to it. So a really great example is a post object. A post could have its own set of variables. A post could have a URL slug, it could have a post title, it could have post content, and these are all variables that would not make sense to access outside of the post. So we wrap them up inside a specific post, and every post object you create would have its own set of variables that match that, right? Then they could have their own functions as well. Like let's say every time I want to tell a post to load on a page, I would just call post.render. So the way we access these are like this. If you're calling a object variable, or what's called a property, it would be dot and then the word. And then if you're calling a function or a method, it would be dot and then activating it. Now the weird thing about this, remember I said that there are function declarations, which are functions without this appearing on it. Sometimes it's hard to tell which one you're using in that case, but in what we're doing, it won't really be an issue. But we will be using this, what's called dot notation, dot property or dot method. Loops let us roll over a collection of items and repeat things, and this is what a classic loop looks like in JavaScript. So this is what's called a for loop. And remember how I said that there are some instances where let and var are useful? Notice how I'm using let here because well, I won't go into why, but this is one of those instances. So luckily in JavaScript, we don't need to write these anymore because we now have a much simpler set of loops like the for of loop. So this does the exact same thing as the last one, but it's a lot cleaner and easier to read. So what this says is for all of the post IDs, I'm going to refer to each one as ID, and I want you to repeat this action on every single one of those IDs. So JavaScript, unlike some languages like Ruby or something that read left to right better, sometimes we're jumping around in how to read this. So it says, for all of the post IDs, give me each, for all of the post IDs, loop through them, name each one ID, and then execute this on each one. So this is a lot simpler way to execute it, and I suggest starting to use these instead of for loops. But there's an even further push in JavaScript to not use any loops at all. And this is using a type of programming called functional programming. Anybody ever heard this term? Yeah. So, for each. The for each exists in JavaScript. I don't really use it, but if you're coming from PHP and you're like, hey, what's a for each? But I'm going to skip over this. What I want to show is this functional approach. And so what normally happens, let's imagine that you're getting all your posts and you want to modify the link somehow. Let's say we're building a JavaScript app. We get the link of our post, but we want to strip out the http.com/site because we want to build our own URLs, right? So we're going to grab all the posts, we're going to loop through them, and we're going to modify that link. At the end of that loop, our original posts are all now modified. And this breaks a principle of functional programming, which is you should not modify your data in this way. What's it called? Immutability? It'll come to me. What they say is a better approach is take that initial group of data, take that initial array, make a copy of it, change everything in that copy, and then work with that copy from there on out. And right, like that makes sense, right? What if I need that initial data? What if I mess it up and something breaks halfway through it, and then like my data's corrupted? Immutability. So you don't want to modify that initial data. So what this is doing is this is saying for all my post IDs, go ahead and what's called map over each one, which means create a duplicate copy of it. Go ahead and do what I tell you to do, and then save all of that as a new value. So we'll see a little bit of this, and definitely if you work with like React or Vue or like ES6 or any of these more modern flavors of writing JavaScript, you won't see any loops used at all, and that's kind of some of the logic behind it. In our stuff today, I think loops are still fine to use in some cases, and especially when we're just taking some set of posts and displaying them all on the page and we're not changing anything about them, right? That's not really breaking that principle, so I think it's fine. But if you're ever in that situation where you have a bunch of data and you're about to like hack it apart, maybe make a copy of it, in general in life, right? Conditional statements are pretty simple. Hopefully everybody could at least kind of figure out from the title what that means, but there are some peculiar things about conditional statements specifically in the context of JavaScript and WordPress. So WordPress has a WordPress JavaScript coding standards. And in it, it outlines some best practices for how you should write your JavaScript if you're including it in a WordPress theme or plugin or WordPress core. And oddly enough, and probably not surprisingly, like these are also not the same as what the general JavaScript community's best practice or coding standards are. But one of the things they have is called Yoda Conditionals. And what that means is that when you're testing a conditional statement, rather than having it read as you normally would, like if logged in is equal to true, you flip that around and if you say if true logged in is, right? And the benefit of this is, I'll show you. Okay, what this is going to do is test to see if something's true, right? What happens if I forgot the extra signs and I did this instead, and I only had one equal sign? What I'm saying in this case is if, and then I say, actually don't mind that if, set logged in to always be true, and execute. So this will always be true. However, if we did this, it's going to give us an error and say, hey, true is like something that you cannot change in JavaScript. You can't come in here and be like, oh, true, something kind of different out. No, that's not allowed. So this will give you an error, whereas this will just always execute as true. And this is a tricky thing to troubleshoot. So that's the reasoning. Whoop. Look how much we have to get through. Hold on. So that's the reason we see it done this way. The other thing I want to point out here is that there's a difference in JavaScript and most programming languages between 2 equal signs and 3 equal signs. So this is a really good example because true and false is a Boolean value in JavaScript, which means it could be one of 2 options. And you could write a Boolean value as either true or false using those words, or you could use 0 and 1. And 0 and 1 are used interchangeably with true and false. And behind the scenes at a binary level, that's all they are. But if we were to change this logged in up top to 1 and use 3 equal signs, it would not work. But if we were to use 2 equal signs, it would work. And that gives you a hint as to what the 3 equal signs does. 3 equal signs checks to see that the value is the same as well as the type of the 2 things that you have. So if I were to change this to 1, it would be like, hey, the value might be the same, but I realize that one of these is a Boolean and one of them is a number. These are 2 different types of things in JavaScript. So when we can, we always want to be as specific as possible in our programming. And that's why 3 equal signs is a more true test. However, sometimes we can't depend on what data we're getting back, and we don't really know, and we have to allow some flexibility. So in those cases, it is OK to use 2 equal signs. Almost all the time, you'll just see 2 equal signs everywhere, but occasionally you'll see 3. And just know that that's a more specific way of checking. All right, we're almost to the end of our college course here. Anybody feeling that like JavaScript brain effect yet? It'll sink in, yeah. OK. So like I said, there are 3 different ways of including JavaScript in a site. The first one is an inline tag. We're not even going to talk about that. But you could actually throw JavaScript in as an attribute on an HTML element. The next most common way is to use an HTML script tag, and then you could run your JavaScript in there. And a lot of the examples we do today will be doing this, not because it's the best practice, but it means that you don't have to have a separate JavaScript file and an HTML file. You could just throw it right in there. WordPress will also do some things like just taking a block of JavaScript and throwing it into your HTML template. Can you think of a plugin that might do this? Google Analytics. So what it does is it takes a block of JavaScript, not like well, kind of exactly like this, and it just throws it in the footer of your site, right? And so that'll just execute right there. It's not going to link to an external file. But then the better practice and more common is something like this, where you link externally to some other file, right? Now, I'm using index.js as an example here because when you get into more complex and like library-driven, like a React app or something, you'll see a naming convention of naming your main JavaScript file as index.js. And I just want to point out that does in no way do the same thing as index.html. They're simply borrowing the nomenclature of like, oh, this is our index over to here. Your index.js will not like load automatically. It doesn't have any special properties. It's simply a naming convention that you'll see. Another common one is calling it like app.js or theme.js, depending on something like that. Now, if we want to do this in WordPress, we can't include it in the HTML. We have to go through WordPress's hook system, because when WordPress is building a page, there's a point it'll reach in the head when it's building it out, and it'll say, hey, plugins and themes, give me your JavaScript, man. I'm going to load it in here. Do you want it at the top of the site? Do you want it in the footer? You got any CSS? Come on, gimme, gimme, gimme. And we have to hook into its system this way. So we'll go into exploring how this works, and we'll have an example file around it. But this is the best practice of what you're going to do, and we get a lot of benefits from doing it this way. Whew. Wow. OK. Discuss amongst yourselves for a moment. Digest that, go over anything new you picked up, anything that you still might have questions about. And we're going to take a little break, and then we'll jump into doing some more coding and some actual examples. All right, let's see a show of hands. Did anybody learn anything new about JavaScript from this? Yay! OK, cool. Did anybody think that they knew some things about JavaScript, but realize that they have even more to learn about JavaScript through this? A little bit? Cool. Yeah, that happens forever. That doesn't stop. So I have a slide that I usually use that isn't in here, but it basically says something along the lines of JavaScript is not actually that difficult a language. The tricky thing is that almost everything you do in JavaScript involves an API. And so what I want to point out several times through today is that what we just covered, like in a nutshell, that's JavaScript. It's a very basic language. Some of the things about how it's run and what it interacts with gets complicated. But a lot of the things that we think we're writing JavaScript, we're not. And I want to distinguish between the JavaScript language, like its syntax and its core functionality, and all of the different APIs that JavaScript plugs into. And one of them is the document object model. Has anybody ever heard this referred to? OK, cool. Don't worry, we'll go into depth about it. But the thing we need to start off saying is that the DOM is an API. It's not JavaScript. It's another library that we could plug into and use using JavaScript. It also works for SVG and XML, like anybody still using that. Sorry, Magento users. OK. So when we have a website in the browser and we start with our HTML, before that HTML is loaded onto the page, it's run through a compiler that converts it into the document object model. So if you've ever used Web Inspector, you ever right-click and open up Web Inspector before, what you're viewing there is the document object model, which is a representation of our HTML. So this is really important to emphasize because when it comes to using JavaScript, we never actually interact with the HTML itself. We're interacting with this DOM that took some HTML, remapped it into something completely new, and now we get to interact with that. But this also points out that everything we're going to see in the DOM, this is not part of the JavaScript language. It's an API. And this is where things get tricky, right? Because all of the different browsers implement these APIs in different ways, and it's not controlled. So the JavaScript core language, you may have heard of the ECMAScript or the ECMA standard working group, which controls ECMAScript, which JavaScript is based on, so is ActionScript, so are like Swift is, right? So I just confused myself. I don't know, the API, separate things. The ECMAScript does not control the DOM. So the DOM has a completely different working group, and you could look up the working group. It has different trajectory of what it's trying to accomplish and all of these different things. So it's two different bodies, two different things, the JavaScript language itself and the document object model. And I think the DOM is on its like third or fourth or ongoing revision. And it has stuff that happens independently of the JavaScript language. And then each browser independently determines how it's going to implement the DOM itself. This is the official, from the working group, definition of what the DOM is. And it points out what the DOM could do really well. So it says that it could build documents, which are HTML pages, or XML or SVG. It can navigate their structure, and it could add, modify, or delete elements and content. So what this breaks down into practical things about JavaScript is that we can select any HTML elements on a page. We can navigate, so we could select something and then navigate to any parent, child, sibling, or other surrounding elements. We could add new elements in, we could edit them, and we could delete them. And this is one of the funnest things about the DOM when you first start. You're like, I can hack anything, just give me a console. And then finally, we could build our own HTML elements and add them to the page. So if you look like at an app like React or Instagram, it's basically an empty HTML tag, and all of that content is built, all of those HTML elements are built out using JavaScript. And so we'll look at the fundamentals of all of this today, but again, like it's hard to get into all of this. So some things like navigating around the DOM, I'm going to skip over, but if you grab those videos, it'll go into depth in that. All right, now's the point where you're going to need those code files and your editor in a few moments. So I'm going to go through some of this, and then we'll hop into doing some practice exercises. So when it comes to selecting HTML elements, remember we have our HTML page, we have our JavaScript document, and the DOM API is going to let us talk between them. What we could do is do something like document. Now this is the DOM that it's referring to, document object model. And anytime you type document in JavaScript, you know, hey, I'm no longer using JavaScript, now I'm using the DOM API. Okay? So now we're in the world of the DOM API. And some of the methods that it has built into it are getElementById. And if I pass this in, it'll find any HTML tag that has an ID of main. Now, have you ever heard before that you should not have more than one of the same IDs on a page? But you could have CSS classes have multiple ones? So this is the reason why. It's not because of JavaScript. It's not because of CSS. Like CSS won't care. HTML won't care. JavaScript technically doesn't care, but the DOM cares. So if you try to execute this and there are two IDs on the page, it's going to be a little bit confused, and you're probably not going to get back the result you expect. Then we have getElementsByTagName, and the important thing to point out here is the S. So this first one, getElementById, it's always going to return one value. Even if you have multiple IDs on the page that match, it'll just give you one of them. I think the first one. However, if you have getElementsByTagName, that's always going to return an array or a collection of values. Even if there's only one link on the page, you're going to get back an array with one value in it. So the reason this is important is because later on we're going to be like, hey, give me this, and then I want to do this with it. So if we use anything that has an S in it, getElements, plural, before saying, give me this, let me do this, you have to say, give me this, give me one of the values inside of it, or loop through them, and then go and do this. So there's this extra step involved. It's also, if you don't have auto code completion, like one of the most common mistakes you make trying to type it out is missing that S or adding it in, something like that. Then we have getElementsByClassName, so anything that has post. And the important thing to point out here with all of these is notice that we don't pass in the hashtag here, and we don't pass in the dot there. So it's not like a CSS selector. However, JavaScript does have these. So query selector will give you the first matching element or the first matching phrase from this. And you could write it exactly like CSS. So you could put hashtags in there for IDs and dots in there for CSS classes. So this will find any element that has a CSS class of entry title and a link inside of it, and it'll give us that value. And if we want to get multiple of these, it's query selector all. I don't know why they didn't just say query selectors, but this was added a little bit later to the JavaScript language than the other ones. So if you've ever used jQuery for the simple purpose of trying to select items from a page and it making it easier, you don't need to do it anymore. You could do it with native JavaScript using a selection of these. The other cool thing about query selector is, let's say that I got an H1 on the page, right? Query selector H1 will give me the first header. I could then use query selector to drill down inside of that. So I could say, hey, start at my H1 and then find the first example of a link inside my H1. So sometimes we'll do one example where you'll see query selector being chained onto itself and finding things within elements, which can be helpful. So with these few things, you could select any element on a page. Now, the thing to point out is that you're probably going to default to using query selector for everything, because it's so much easier to write CSS classes, right? The thing to keep in mind is that behind the scenes, this is running a bunch of conditional statements and then executing one of these three. So if you look at the source code for how this is working, it's introduced nothing new to the language. It's just doing more stuff for you. In my general recommendation is pick the lowest level functionality for what you need to work. Don't add layers of complexity onto it. That said, I used to say that pretty strongly until I did the actual performance tests to see if it made any significant difference. And I was really disappointed to find out it doesn't at all. So you could technically use them. It won't slow down your site at all. But I think it's nice to think that way of hey, if this is going to do all this extra stuff behind the scenes that I don't need, if all I need is an ID, I'm going to use document get element by ID. Performance-wise, you don't need to. JavaScript is wicked fast. So in this example here, we grab a link and we grab an input tag. And now we could drill down even further into these and do things like, hey, my link, give me the text inside that link. Or maybe that link has a strong tag with some text inside of it, and then some more text, and then a span tag with some stuff inside of that. Give me everything that is in there that's HTML. So if I had a link that had a strong tag inside and I asked for inner text, it wouldn't tell me that there's a strong tag. But if I have inner HTML, then it'll tell me all the HTML. You could also drill down and get any attribute of an element. So if I want to get its ID or class or anything like that, I could do that. I could grab an href of a link, right? And then has anybody ever heard of HTML5 data attributes? So you could create your own custom attributes in HTML. Did you know that? That's pretty cool. If you just say data-location in an H1 tag, then you could store some custom information in there. And I'll show you a way to do that. In general, now that we have better state management in JavaScript, we're moving away from that practice. But it's a good hack and get around, but don't tell anybody I said that. The most important thing to mention here is that anytime you're dealing with a form element, you can't drill down in the same way. So there's no inner text or inner HTML of a form. You always have to use .value. So this could get a little confusing too when you're starting off. You're like, yeah, I'm getting all this stuff from the DOM. I'm good to go. And then I go to a form. I'm like, what? I got to use .value. And .value won't work the other way around. So just something to point out there about forms, and we'll get a good practice in with that. Now, once we get all this stuff, the great thing about JavaScript is this is all pulling stuff out of the DOM API. Imagine going to the WordPress API and say, give me your posts. This is what we're doing with the DOM API. We're saying, hey, we're making a request for this content. But we could also tell the DOM API, hey, go ahead and update this stuff and change these values. So in this example, we're grabbing a link again, the first link on the page, and we're going to say, hey, change the href of this to my site. Sorry, Google, no more traffic for you. I'm taking all your links, and I'm changing them to my href. So this will automatically update in the DOM live. We could also do things like change the inner text or even change the inner HTML of a value on the fly. Of course, if we wanted to work with a form, then we would need to do .value instead and change that. The one small thing I'll mention here is CSS classes. And just picture for a minute a article tag, and it has a class of post, post-id the name of the ID, and then it has like 3 other classes, right? So we have this string of text with spaces between them, and we want to say, go ahead and add a new class to it. We can't take that string of 3 or 4 different words with spaces in between and just override it completely with our new one word, right? What we would have to do is pull that string out, parse it by spaces, split everything up into an array, add a new item into that array, and then take that array and build it back into a string with spaces again and add it. So because this is a complete pain in the ass, we have a completely other web API that exists. So again, what I'm going to show you here is not technically JavaScript, but we have class list. So this is one of the weird things that's confusing about JavaScript, right? Like, we don't have to load class lists. The browser engine will do it for us. So we're technically using an API without ever having to reference or call that API. Same thing with the DOM. So we could do class list add, and it'll do all that work for us, and it has toggle, which is so handy in cosmetic JavaScript to toggle a class on and off, and even with animations, you can make it all smooth. So don't ever do .class on something. Use class list instead. So what we're going to do now with a practice exercise is bring all of this together. And in this practice exercise, you're going to have a basic, what looks like a simple WordPress site. And I'm going to say, hey, go get the page title, go get the content title, go get all the paragraphs, get this input field. And then once we get everything, we're going to hack it and say, now change all of these values, and I want to see them live. So let me show you real quick before we jump into it exactly what we're going to be doing. Don't look at my desktop. Okay, I'm going to open these up here and open them up in Finder. Okay, so the way these files are set up is that we have the basics, which we're in now, and then all of these example files. And then for each example file, there's a completed version of it as well. Okay, so if you get stuck at any point, you could just pop it open that way. Oh, looking at the completed one. Okay, so what we want to do is basically take a site like this. I'm going to say, hey, grab some of the values, and then once it's completed and we change it around, then it will look something like this, where it says hacked, and then all the paragraphs are different, and we've added our own value into our username, into their input field. How I would suggest doing all of these is taking the entire folder and dragging it into your text editor. So what that's going to allow you to do is have all of the example files, and you don't need to open them up individually one by one. The other thing about these example files is if we had to spend all day coding, we would be spending all day coding. So what I've done is I've done a lot of the coding for you in these examples, and all you'll see is a bunch of instances of something that just says change. And these are all the things that you'll have to change, and then it'll automatically work. And there's 2 reasons for this. One is because we don't have time. We get through 2 examples in 3 hours if you had to code all this yourself. The other is that it's rare that we actually code anything from scratch nowadays, right? So much of it is, oh, I already did this in a project, or hey, I'm going to take this from Zach's workshop and use it in my own thing, right? And we just copy and paste it. But when we do that, we need to understand key fulcrum points in that code that we do need to change. So the things I've done here are like selective. This is the type of stuff. Some of this stuff is just copy and paste template. But I tried to pick the things that you would commonly have to change or you really have to know about to work with. So what you're going to do in this specific example is it says, OK, find the page title. We'll do this first one together. So if I come up into my HTML, this is my page title. Someone suggest a way to select this with JavaScript. It'll start with document dot something. Sorry, I couldn't hear that. OK, query selector and then the class. Let's try that. Document dot query selector and then dot entry title. Perfect. OK, y'all go through and do the rest of these on your own. And what I suggest is don't worry about coding it all yourself. If you have a partner and you just want to watch them type, that's fine, but switch it up a little bit. So I'll give you a few moments here to go through and try to fix this. I'm going to start live coding this, so if you want to keep working through on your own, but that's a bit of time for you to get started. So I'll give you some time if you want to keep coding on your own, but just to show you the examples that I used here. To get the page content, I just duplicated the same thing as before and changed the CSS class. So the original element that we had was a big div tag that says entry content. This is all copied from underscores, by the way, so this is pretty common WordPress classes. And then for username, I did that one a little bit differently because this input field on the side here has an ID. So the simplest way to grab that would be get element by ID. And then finally for the p tags, I did get elements by tag name only to be difficult and weird because query selector all would also work for that. And query selector would work for all of these except the last one. So you could also do something like this. But the important thing to remember is that if you're getting back a bunch of p tags, you need to use all, otherwise it will only return one. So this is another API. Anybody ever use the console in your web inspector? I'll show you how to access this in a quick second here. I'm going to comment out this other stuff because it'll break our JavaScript. What console does is it's an API for consoling out things in JavaScript. And .log is one of the most common things. But if you've ever dug a little bit deeper, there's like 10 or 12 or 20 other things that the console can do that you could tie into. But this will basically let us log out a string of text that says the page title, and then it's going to give us the value that we got out. So let me just load this in the browser real quick. And if I open up my inspector by right-clicking and clicked Inspect, you're probably familiar, a lot of you raised your hands that you've seen the Elements Inspector. This one here. Well, the next tab over is the console. And this is where we could log out some stuff from JavaScript that we could see in the browser. So we could see our page title, we got that h1, page content, username, and our p tags is actually a list of a bunch of different ones, but we could click into the individual ones and find them. So now that we have everything selected, we're going to work on changing these values. And we could do these together pretty quick because it doesn't really take any JavaScript. We're just going to change the page title. We're going to call this hacked new page title. And then for page content, notice that here we're using inner text. So that means that all we have to give it back is some text. Is this font size okay? Should I bump it up? It's okay? Bump it up? Okay. Give him some of that 38-point font. Let's see how that does. Poco mejor. Is this better? Yeah, okay. So if we're going to pass back inner HTML, that means that we probably want to pass back some actual markup in our string of text. So for here, I'm going to pass new lorem, just some text, but with the p tags in here. Because otherwise, if we just pass a string of text into inner HTML, we're going to end up with text on a page that has no markup besides maybe like a div or something higher than that. So we want to avoid that. For username, you can put in whatever your common username is. And then we have a loop here. And we're saying, OK, for all of the paragraph tags, give me them one at a time, and then change the inner HTML of each one to something different. This could also be inner text. But I'm just going to change this to all paragraphs are the same. And I'm doing this for a reason. If we come over and we look at our site now, notice that we have because I'm doing inner HTML on a paragraph tag. So and because it's already typed in the example, I didn't want to correct it because it's already inner HTML in your code. Something broke here. Okay, we see hack new page title. All paragraphs are the same, but I was expecting that to do something different. Okay. Notice how on this line, we added in a new paragraph tag, but here it's not affected. So this is kind of a weird behavior, right? You would expect, I just added a paragraph tag here, and down here I said go through all my paragraph tags and change the value of them. Can anybody figure out why this doesn't work as we would expect it to? Why this one paragraph tag is not affected by this loop here? Because the p tag has already been set up. So because all of our paragraphs were selected here, this paragraph is not pulled into that pool up here. And this is really, really important to mention in JavaScript. When we start dynamically creating elements on the fly, some of them are in memory, some of them are in the page, and then we try to go do stuff with them, we may be trying to select things that aren't there yet, that have already been added, and we've missed getting them, and all sorts of different things. And this gets even more complex when you start working with events, because you're like, why isn't this click happening? Well, because you added it before that link was even on the page, and something like that. So I bring this up to point out, if you're familiar with CSS and the cascading principle, that as your stuff comes later on, it overrides that stuff. The same thing happens in JavaScript, except it could go a lot of other different ways too. So just something to keep in mind, and this is our basic example here. Are there any questions from this offhand? Brilliant. Okay, let's keep going then. So what you would traditionally learn after you learn how to select any element on the page is how to do what's called traversing or navigating the DOM. And what this means is, okay, let's say I got a link. When I click that link, I want to toggle the whole section of content that it's in. So to do that, I need to navigate from the link up to the proper parent element. Maybe I need to go to 2 or 3 parent elements, and then I need to affect the CSS for that. But maybe we have a button that we click it and it adds a new field to the page somewhere else, and other things slide out, and we need to be able to tell where we are and what else we should be affecting. We're not going to do it because what I found in the past, when we go this far into JavaScript, then we never get into the API and into the theme level. So this is one of the important things that you do need to know, and it's in that set of free videos I was telling you about. But we don't technically need it to do this other stuff we're going to do today, so we're going to kind of glance over it at this point. But just know that that is something that is important to understand, how to get parent elements, child elements, and siblings. What we are going to talk about, because it's hugely important, is being able to create HTML and add it to a page with JavaScript. Like I said, most JavaScript-based sites or applications now are almost 100% generating all of that HTML on the fly. And now they're doing it with really cool and fancy frameworks. Like if you work with React and you've seen JSX, you're basically writing HTML in your JavaScript, and then React is going to recompile all of that and turn it back into some JavaScript and run a bunch of stuff behind the scenes. What we're going to look at here today is what every single framework uses behind the scenes to build out all those elements. What you're also going to find out by the time we get through this is like, dear God, I would never want to do this again after today. So thank goodness for these other frameworks that make it easier. But if you do have to do it, I'm going to show you a bit of a hacker approach that makes doing it a lot less verbose. So the first thing we have to say about this is that in the world of the DOM, there is no HTML. There are no HTML elements. The DOM does not have something called an H1 tag. The DOM has a node that inherits a bunch of things that eventually builds out what we see and think of as an H1 tag, but inherently in it, it has no H1 tag. So what we have to shift our mind into thinking about is a node-based architecture. So in the DOM, everything is a node. An H1 tag is a node. A space on your page, a space in your code, a line break, that's a node. An attribute, that's a node. If you have text on a page, that's a different node than your HTML element. Every single HTML element is a different type of node, and then they all have these inheritances where there's one master node, and then there's different ones building out from all of that. So there are a few common types of nodes. If you, in your HTML, type doc type HTML5 or something, you know, that goes at the top of your page, you're familiar with that, right? That's one type of node. If you have, well, your actual document, their whole HTML page, that's a node too. If you have any HTML element, that's a certain type of node. If you have text, like I said, comments, this magical unicorn called document fragments, which like lets you store stuff in it, but then disappears when you add it to a page, which we won't get into today. But really, it's these two that we want to talk about the most. And again, this is a place where you could check out those videos and go into depth in understanding the DOM. But the reason we have to talk about these is because when you first learn JavaScript, you don't learn that text is something completely different in the DOM than an HTML element. And if we ever want to create an HTML element and add text to it, we can't just create an HTML element and add text. We have to create a text node and an HTML element node, and then add the text node into that HTML node. So if we don't understand how these work, then you start to do things and you get this error like, this is not the correct node type. And it's really frustrating. You're like, WTF, and like, what is going on here? And this is the reason why. So let's take this basic HTML. Take a look at this for a moment. This shouldn't be anything complex or new to anyone. And sadly, there is no DOM visualization. I don't know how nobody has built a library, but I look for it all the time. And like, nobody's said, take this in HTML and show me what it looks like to the DOM. This is a rough representation of what it looks like. So we have the window, which is a whole other object. We have our document, which is a type 9, our doc type, and then we get down to the actual HTML tag. So that's at the second line of our code up there on the side. Then it splits out, and we have our head or title. This, you could read this, right? I don't have to explain it. The thing I want to point out is that notice the type is 3 for any text. And notice how anytime you have text, it's a node inside of or underneath of an element node. So this is to just bring home something that is totally simple when you break it down this way, but when it's not explained in JavaScript, it leads to a lot of issues. Now, the pain in the ass thing about this is for every piece of text on this page and for every element, we have to write like 1 to 3 lines of code in order to create it and then connect them all together. So what we're going to look at is that process. There are 2 more methods. Remember, anytime we type document, we're no longer doing JavaScript. We're now out in the DOM API. And it has an API call for create element and create text node. And create element, we could pass it anything. I could pass a Z Gordon here, and it'll create me a Z Gordon tag. It won't be valid HTML, but the document doesn't care because the DOM API for this is not tied in with what version of HTML. Remember, that's a whole other separate working group, a whole different thing, and then the DOM determines how it should work with that. Right? This is why there's so many different moving parts, and it can get complicated. But we can pass it, any element. This is going to create a paragraph tag. And then anytime you create a text node, you have to pass in the text to that. So like I said, if we wanted to just create a paragraph and add text, we can't do that without creating both of them independently. The next thing we have to talk about is appending nodes. So we have 2 ways. Appending is a specific term, but it's also used in the general sense of just saying, hey, I have something in memory in JavaScript. I want to add it to my page in the browser. And we have 2 ways of doing this. The most common one is append child. And what that means is take anything and add this inside it to the end. Yeah, because append goes at the end, prepend goes at the beginning. I don't know why they didn't call insert before prepend child, but they called it insert before. And you need a little bit more going on here. So if I wanted to insert, let's say I had a bunch of lists like this, and I want to insert something before the second list item. I have to tell it what the parent is, so I have to say, get me this UL, and then get me this item that I wanted to go before, and then here's my stuff to put inside. Technically, I think behind the scenes, insert before is actually using append child with some other conditionals. So here's a quick example where on the first line, we create a paragraph tag. On the second line, we create text, and then we take that text and we append it into our paragraph. And this pattern is so common, we're going to see it again and again and again and again until the point we decide, oh, I'm never going to have to do that again. So read through this code and see if you can figure out what it's doing. So what we have at the very first line is we're grabbing something from the page itself. And this is really important because if we're building something in memory, eventually we're going to have to say, hey, add this to the page. So at some point, we're going to have to say where on the page we want that to go. And just as a general best practice, that's usually the first thing you outline in your little block of code. You say, all right, here's my container element, and it's often called container, or here's where, whatever it is that I want to have, and then that's going to go at the top. It's also going to be the very last line because after we build everything, we're going to append it onto the page itself. So the next thing we're doing is we're creating an anchor tag and some text that says link. Then we're going to modify those link attributes, right? We're saying, go ahead and take my text, put that in my link, and change the href to JavaScript for WP. And then finally, take this link that I just built up and append it to the page. Now, this is super simple for something like a link. But imagine if I said, picture the Facebook UI. Scroll through it for a few times. Now go ahead and build out every HTML element on that page using this pattern. Right? Like, how many lines of code is that? So what happens with this code is it's often taken and then broken down into functions. So you have a function that is for building certain types of tags. You have functions that are building list items with links, and all of these helper things that are built up so that you don't have to do as much of this manually. Now, there's another approach that I call the hacker style approach. And this is going to be using inner HTML. And it does this really curious thing by completely bypassing all of that need for creating the document.createElement and create text node, because it's going to do it all for you. So let's walk through this. The first and last lines are almost the same. In this first one, we're grabbing the same element from the page. We're just saying, grab me the first paragraph. But then notice at the bottom, we're not using append child. We're saying inner HTML, right? So the difference is append child, if I have a bunch of content and I append something to that, it will add it to the end. If I use inner HTML, I'm saying take everything over here, completely throw it out, and replace it with this new value. So you can't use inner HTML override and appending completely interchangeably, because one is going to completely override a value and one is going to add something in. But what you can do is you could create a dummy element, change its inner HTML, and then add that to the page. So the heart of why this approach is different is because we're creating an empty string at the top, and then we're concatenating to it each time. So plus equal means equals markup plus this new value. So it's just adding to it every time. Now, the cool thing about this is these are not nodes. In JavaScript's mind and in the DOM's mind, this is a string of text, right? This is not HTML at this point. It's not an HTML node. It's not a text node. But as soon as we run this string of text through inner HTML, behind the scenes, the JavaScript compiler or engine is going to do all of that interpretation for us, figure out, it's going to parse that string of text, and it's going to create all of those element nodes and all those text nodes automatically for us and write all of that code for us. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening behind the scenes, and this is why it's super easy to write this way. I don't know why or how or where this loophole was created. It seems like quite a complexity, but thank goodness for it, because it lets us do things a lot easier. So what we're going to do now is a practice exercise where we're going to open up that same looking site again, and you're going to see a post. It's got a title, and it's got some content. And then with JavaScript, we're going to try to create the exact same type of post, from the article tag to the h2 to the link inside of it to the div controlling the entry content and all that. And we're going to do it the really manual way so that you can see the process of using creating element nodes and then appending them all to each other. And then we're going to show the hacker approach and try that out, which is a lot simpler, and we can see the similarities and differences there. So let me just show you real quick what we're trying to do here. This is exercise 1.2. You'll notice that we have a post here, and if I were to look at the markup for it, right here, you'd see we've got an article tag with an H2 with a link inside of it, and then a div with entry content and a paragraph inside of that. So we basically want to duplicate this whole article tag all using vanilla JavaScript. So if I come into my example file, you'll see that there is a lot of this already set up for you. Like I said, I'm going to take the boilerplate writing out of this so we could focus on specifically the things we want to focus on. Y'all help me out here. If I want to create an article tag, what parameter do I pass into create element? Article in union. Let's try this again. OK, if I want to create an H1 tag, what do I pass into create element? Thanks for humoring me, y'all. We'll keep going. What do I pass in here? Link, right? Come on, yeah, a tag. Here we're going to pass in a div, and here we're going to pass in a paragraph tag. So this isn't necessarily that difficult, but imagine you have like hundreds of elements on a page. This can get to be a lot. Now, what do we want to call our header text? Give me a title of some sort. My title. And what do we want to call our paragraph text? Yeah, we do. Okay. Okay, so now we have our article, which we created up here, and we want to add a certain class to it. So I have to figure out what that class is. I'm just going to come up here. I can see I've got a post class here, entry title, and entry content. I'm just going to try to remember those. Okay, so I'm going to, on my article, I'm going to use the class list, which again is not JavaScript, it's another API. And then on my header, I'm going to pass entry title. My link, we're not going to worry about links now. We'll mess around with links later. And then entry content. Pretty simple so far, right? So this format of writing code when you're creating functions that help you build out actual HTML elements is really common. You define everything up at the top. You make any modifications to attributes right here, and then the last bit of your code is going to be appending and putting everything together. Okay, so we go from the bottom up. We go from the most smallest element here and out from there. So in our header, we start with what goes inside of the H tag or the A tag itself from this list here. What's up? Header text. Yep, right? So we'll take our header text for our header, and we'll put that here. And then once we have that inside of our link, what's going to go inside of our H1 element? It's this link right here. So we type link. And then what's going to go inside of our article tag? It's this header right here. So this is the pattern. And as you start typing this and seeing it, it gets more and more drilled in, where you start with the actual text you want, you put that inside what element you want, and then you keep passing them inside of each other. Now, technically, think that would work? Totally works. Totally not how we should write our JavaScript. Because we could take it one further. We could even start doing like document dot, we could do something like this. Document dot create text node. Oh no, hold on. Never mind. I was just going to show you even more complicated ways of writing it. Don't do that. The WordPress coding standards are very specific. They say that each line should have one thing happening. So if you're doing one line of coding and you're making 10 things happen, so like each of these are something very different, you got to find that happy medium. I say spread it out. WordPress likes its space in its code. It likes its readability. This is a lot easier to read than the other one. But I'll admit, you come up with some clever stuff sometimes. You're like, oh, look how I can pack so much into one line right now. This is great, right? Yeah, it's great, but not great for anyone else that's trying to come along and understand what's going on. So same process here. We've got our paragraph tag. We're going to start off by putting in our paragraph text. And then we're going to take our content P and put that into our content, and take our content and put that into our article. And then at the very end, we're going to take our whole article and append it into the page. So a few things to point out here. One is that we're kind of taking a risky approach. We're building an article tag, and then we're adding an H1 in, and then we're building all of our content, and then we're adding that in. What happened if these lines got switched? We would then see our content displaying before our header. So you have to be very purposeful when you're appending things and be aware, once again, of like the order of how things are added is very important in this instance. So this is the appending mode. And again, this is just for one article. So imagine if we had to do this over and over again, we could see how this gets verbose. So in the other example file here, we could do the same thing with a lot less code. So what we're doing here is we're saying, all right, go ahead and, sorry. Okay, so first thing we have, I'm trying to think. I'm going through all these. Should I give y'all some time? Do you want to try taking a stab at this on your own, or do you prefer that I kind of walk through it? Anyone else? Okay, I'll keep going with this one. So what we have to do at first is get the main post container. So eventually we're going to add some stuff to the page, and we want to find out what that stuff is, and that is going to be this section here called posts. So we could do document get element by ID posts. Then we're going to create our elements. So we'll create an article tag, and then we do our markup. And this is really important. So remember how I said that if we have a bunch of content on the page, we can't use inner HTML to replace it all, right? We have to use an append to add in there. So what we're going to do in this is use a combination of the two of them. We're going to create an actual element called article, and then we're going to create a bunch of markup and apply that inner HTML to that article. Then we're going to take that article and append it into the page so that we're not replacing everything that's already there. So what we'll do here, again, we know our article has a class list of post, and because this is an actual node and not just a string of text, we need to do it this way. But then this is all our markup that will be passed inside. I don't think this should be there, right? No. Yeah. Okay. And then once we have all our markup done, we're going to take our article tag, which we created up here, which has nothing in it. So that the fact that we're replacing all the inner HTML doesn't matter too much. So we take that markup, pass it in, and then we take our article and append it onto the page. And the reason, again, we're not doing something like container inner HTML is equal to markup is because we already have a post on the page. And we don't want to replace that post. We just want to add our new article to the page. So when we come over and run this in the browser, we can see we now have 2 duplicate posts. So like I said, a lot of the web that we view today, the stuff I showed you here in this pattern is more common. This pattern is going on all the time. And that's just something to keep in mind. Like when you load a page now, remember like everything that's happening behind the scenes, especially when it comes to JavaScript. And we won't get to it today, but this is why things like Vue and React and Angular make it a lot easier to build stuff out, because we kind of get to write some pseudo-y, HTML-y stuff, and it's going to do more of the work behind the scenes. Yeah. It'll create them because the JavaScript DOM, or the DOM, does not care or really pay attention to what's legal and what's not in HTML. Exactly. Yep. Yeah. That's exactly what would have happened. Yep. I might be wrong, and in some instances, I know more browsers are getting smart about like removing weird closing tags and stuff. Like actually, if you try to force it to do something broken, it'll fix it. But as far as I know, the DOM is agnostic and not aware of what the proper syntax is, and it'll do whatever you tell it to do. Yeah. Let's see, how are we doing on time? What? About halfway? Okay. Let's go through events, and then we'll take a little break. Is that okay? Yeah? Okay. Because then once we get through this, then we've finished all the JavaScript for today, and we could focus on like the API and WordPressy stuff after that. Events in JavaScript. Again, events are part of the DOM API, so events do not exist in the core JavaScript language. And again, why we call this a JavaScript workshop, and we spend most of the time talking about APIs rather than the core language itself. And the reason is because there are hundreds of events that could happen in JavaScript. So we've got mouse events, anywhere the mouse is moving, what position it is, anywhere that you're scrolling on the page, figuring out what keys are being pressed if you want to hack someone's password or if you want to create a Google Docs. Yeah, ever think about the JavaScript in Google Docs? I use that app every day, man. It's not easy stuff they do. It's not pretty code either. Form events, so anytime you're working with forms, this is a big thing with JavaScript, right? Doing front-side validation, responses, things like that. Anything with media, you could create your own custom media players. Like you could even take a YouTube video and pull that raw file out and skin it completely for your own using. So it's a cool way to repurpose YouTube hosting but have it look completely custom on your site. Drag and drop events completely with native JavaScript, moving stuff around. It's actually not too difficult to do. Window events, pop-up windows, right? Yeah. But other things like resizing windows, figuring out when stuff is resized, figuring out where they're scrolling on the page, right? Like all the sticky JavaScript stuff or scrolling somewhere around. So all of this is available with native JavaScript. And again, in that set of videos, there's like a 40-minute video in there where I show you how to do all of these with native JavaScript, everything from light boxes to media players and all sorts of fun stuff. So that's worth taking some time to explore. But today we're just going to look at one simple type of event, and that's a click event, right? Because it's one of the most common to track, and it's pretty easy to work with. Now, there are three different types of ways to hook into events in JavaScript. We have an inline one, which we're going to kind of ignore, the global one, which I mentioned for a reason I'll get to in a moment, and then event listeners, which are really the best practice. So inside of JavaScript, we could technically write something like this, and that will execute when you click on it. We could also call it like on mouse over, and it would do that instead. I can't think of a single reason why you will ever need to do this, but it's a good idea to know that it's there, just like with CSS. Now, another approach is this one. Now, this is in our HTML. The second one is in JavaScript itself. So we could say, give me an anchor tag, right, like document.querySelector A, and .onClick equals say hi. Now, say hi here is a function reference. Remember I always said that if we do a function call and put parentheses here, so if I were to do say hi with parentheses, as soon as JavaScript reads that line, it's going to say hi. It's not going to wait for that click event to happen. So this is where function reference is important. The problem with this is that you can only attach one function this way. So I can't do a.onClick say hi, and then on the next line say a.onClick something else. It only has one space that you could save that property to. So for that reason particularly, we don't take this approach. Now, what's weird to me about the way some of these modern frameworks like React are architecting themselves is that we've gone back in a lot of ways to using this kind of method. And if that makes sense to you, like, yeah, nod your head with me. If not, don't worry about it. This is really the recommended approach. So in this case, we're grabbing our anchor tag and we're saying add an event listener onto it. When somebody clicks, go ahead and do the following. And again, this is a function reference. This is going to do the exact same thing as the previous line. But the nice thing about this is we could add as many event listeners onto the same object as we want. And that flexibility is super. So this is what a basic event listener setup looks like. Take a moment to just read through this code, and then I'll walk through it. OK, so on the first line, we're getting a link. Nothing new there. On the second line, we're adding an event listener to it, and we're saying when this link is clicked, go ahead and execute this function. And that's a function reference that is just referring to it and won't be called until that click happens. And then in our function, we're saying alert, hey, tell the world that this link was clicked. And this will totally work, and it's a pretty simple setup, not too hard. Has anybody ever used an event listener in your code? Cool. So let's talk about the event object. Does anybody understand the event object that uses event listeners? Yeah, this one guy. We're going to talk later. Oh my gosh. So when I was working on my master course, I remember one of the darkest months I had was it literally took me a month of researching nearly every day to get to the point where I felt I fully understand the event object and how it works. So man, I don't even know where to start on this. Do I do this slide first or that one? Let me do this one first. Yeah, let's start here. OK. So something really weird happens in JavaScript that doesn't happen in other languages. First of all, JavaScript is a compiled language. A lot of people incorrectly say that it's interpreted language, which means that in a compiled language, it has to be bundled down into one executable file, and then that file is executed and it runs, right? You're familiar with these kind of things? You ever download a .exe file or work with languages that way? The reason people think that JavaScript is not that way is because it's always changing and interacting with the DOM. But this is not actually true. JavaScript is compiled, and it's almost compiled, you could say, twice. It happens once, and it creates all the scope, and it determines all the variables and everything. And then it's compiled again, and it's interloped in with, I guess you could use the word, or it's combined in with the DOM. And so we have this kind of live runtime environment where code that we wrote is like compiled down, but then it's almost opened up again, and it begins to interact with this DOM API. And really strange things can happen there. So let's say that we write a function called display clicked info, and then we alert out event. Where have we defined event here? Nowhere, right? We never said what event is. But what happens with JavaScript is that if we use event listener, which is part of the DOM API, it will hook into whatever function we have, and then it will interject its own code into our function in runtime when that click happens. This does not happen with a lot of programming languages, that somebody else can start messing with stuff, and then it's going to automatically start interjecting things into your code that you didn't even ask for. So nowhere did I say, hey, give me the event. It's just going to give it to you. And what's weird about this is that different browsers call this event object different things. Like in some, it's called arguments 0 something, and then in Chrome, it's called event. So there's no real consistency. So every browser will, when you click on an event or when an event happens, it'll take that event information and interject it into whatever function. So what we have to do is we have to be specific about saying, hey, browser, I know, or hey, DOM, whatever, your engine, I know you're going to be giving me something, so I'm just going to tell you I want to refer to this as event. Because different browsers call it different things. And even though here we don't pass in any parameters, JavaScript or the DOM will for us pass that in. So I don't know if I'm really making sense of the kind of complexity and weirdness of this, but I think it's really strange that basically we don't ever ask for this thing. It's just going to be given to us. And for cross-browser reasons, you usually want to write out event this way. Now, sometimes you'll see it done this way. Anybody ever see something like that? The reason is because people are rightly weary of taking something that exists, like there's a whole event object in Chrome, creating a new variable called event, and then assigning that variable event to this new variable and completely overriding that other one. Like we talked about immutability, that's probably not, well, I guess it's not technical. Anyways, so the reason they use E is just to avoid overriding that normal name. You'll see them both. I used to think maybe E was a little bit smarter, but from folks I've asked, they say just do event because it's more consistent and people reading it, it's more clear than like what does E mean, right? But you'll see that same stuff. So the event object has a bunch of things attached to it, and if we don't have the time now, but if you go through those videos, one of the exercises is like log out that event object, and you have so much data, everything short of their like billing address about where the browser was, what time it was, where they were scrolled on the page, like where the mouse was, what element was clicked, what other things were triggered, all this other stuff. And you could drill down into that and get different things. Like you could say event.type, was it a link event, a mouse over, was it whatever that was. And then event.target is the most specific thing, or the most important one to know about. So event.target is the element that was actually clicked. Because here's another thing. How does click info know what it was attached? How does this function know it was attached to this one? And then how does it get that information back into itself on the page, right? So the way that's done is with event target. And something that we're going to glance over here, but the naming convention of target comes out of a weird thing in the DOM. So when you click on a link, you would think, all right, what's going to happen? That link is going to be notified that it was clicked on. But what really happens is when you click on an element, it starts up at the window object and goes through every HTML parent and notifies it that that link was clicked on. Then it notifies the click itself, or the target itself, that it was clicked on. And then it goes back up the chain and it notifies everything once again. And this process happens with every single event. So anytime you mouse over anything on the screen, it's running this huge trajectory of events. And there's a lot of event data that's being processed so quickly in JavaScript. So event.target will give us whatever we clicked on. The other common one that you'll see is event.preventDefault, which will prevent whatever the default action was from happening. So if we have a form and we want to validate it before it submits, you type event.preventDefault on that form, and that would prevent it from being submitted. Luckily, to do what we need to do, we could gloss over all of this, but I think it's pretty interesting. The other thing that we could probably gloss over, but I'll mention it, is removing event listeners. So removing event listeners may happen for a couple reasons. One is, let's imagine we're toggling open like customizer, like the customizer pane. And we have one set of behaviors that we want to execute when they are toggling open, and another set when they're toggling closed. So when they toggle it open, we could remove all the event listeners from that were doing stuff for the opposite behavior. And then when they toggle it back closed again, then we could add in all those event listeners again. So we're essentially taking one element, and as it's being used, we're unhooking and hooking back in different behaviors to it. That's one. Another is memory loss. So how many of you keep something like a Facebook or a Google or a Gmail open in a tab somewhere in your browser, like for extended periods of time, right? So here's something you may or may not have known about event listeners. Let's say that I say, okay, every single link on my page I'm going to attach an event listener to, right? This is not super uncommon. Now, I come back a day later, that page has auto-refreshed, all those old posts are gone, and I see a bunch of new ones with new event listeners attached onto them, right? When you remove an element from a page, it doesn't remove the event listener from memory. So just because we pull that thing off the page, in memory, it's still listening for that to happen. And this can create something called memory leaks, which in JavaScript can get really significant, especially if you create an app that people are going to be leaving open for days and days and like months, right? Some people have all these tabs and it's just running JavaScript continuously in the background, updating itself. So we have this weird scenario, right? Like of if I remove an element from a page, we haven't looked at remove, but it's not hard to figure out what it does. That event listener still exists. However, when I set the element back to null, then that overrides it. So like there's this weird scenario, and another great thing that every major JavaScript framework now that's building out UI does is it handles all of this for you, and they call it, generically refer to it as like part of the garbage cleanup of working with event listeners. So you don't really have to worry about this. I doubt anybody's going to go out and build a vanilla JS app that's like big enough that you have to worry about this problem. But I would say it's always a good practice to think about not just adding event listeners, but think about when does this need to be removed. And building your applications in a way that's flexible enough that things can be hooked in and hooked out easily is a really flexible and nice approach to take. So all that said, what we're going to do in this little last practice before we take a break is we're basically going to have open and all of these are building up to somewhere, so this will all come together and be a little bit nicer than what we're doing now. But we have a bunch of titles that are output on the page, and then when you click on one, see that text down there, and it says you clicked on this title? I know, not the sexiest example. This is so silly, but it's going to get us to where we want to go. And I'll say again, this point again, in order to do this much with JavaScript, we have to understand this much. So think about how much we've talked about and glanced over today just to understand the core mechanics of this, right? There's a lot. So I'm going to change this up this time. I'd like you to try doing this one on your own or with a partner, because I think if I walk you through this, I'm going to put the rest of y'all to sleep. So in this example, you're basically going to select all of the links on the page, and then for each of those links, you're going to add an event listener. You're going to pass in your event object, and then you're going to prevent the default behavior and update this new thing here. And I'll talk about this and what's going on in a moment. So take a stab on that, with that on your own, and call over any TAs or anybody if you need help, and then we'll go over it together. folks, at this point, if you want to take a little break before we pick up, if you want to get something to drink or use the bathroom, you can go ahead and do that if you want to keep coding. And then when we come back, I'll real quickly go over the completed version of this, and then we'll shift gears and get into the WordPress REST API. All righty. OK, I'm going to wrap up this example real quick, and then I will go into talking about the API. So if we're getting all of our links, we would simply grab a paragraph tag to loop through all the links, look like that. And then for each specific link that we have, we want to call our handle click function. And I'm using the phrase handle click here. This is actually a pretty common nomenclature you'll see in apps where whatever it is that they want to handle, they will call that function handle whatever. So if it's like handle submit click form, then or if it's a submit button on a form, then the function would be named handle submit button click. So this is one style of naming. Another style of naming would be like saying what it's going to do, like show event, something like that. Right? So there's two different naming conventions. Just want to expose you to them both. Anytime we have an event object or a function that's pulling in an event, we want to pass that in specifically so that we work cross browsers. And then let's see, get the title of the link clicked. So that's going to be our event.target, which will give us the actual HTML element. And then we want to get the title inside of that, so we'll do inner text. So this is how we select whatever it was that was clicked on. So in this case, it was whatever link it was. And then if we do .inner text, that will give us the value. Our main container is this one right here, ID clicked title. So that's where we're going to be echoing out that title to. And then anytime that we want to take over JavaScript or take over an event's default behavior, we always have to use event prevent default. And now technically, this could go at the end of a function, but I always feel a little uneasy, like so nervous, like what happens if it doesn't stop and then my code doesn't have time to execute? So my personal preference is after I set up my variables, I always run my prevent default if it's needed. Other folks like to say put it very last. I don't know why. Like technically, it'll work either way, but I prefer this approach. So then we're going to basically replace the container that we grabbed, so that little div that says click title, and we're going to put inside of it a paragraph tag with our actual title variable. And I want to point out something new here, which is called template strings. So this line right here does the same as this line right here. In the second line here, we're using traditional concatenization in JavaScript by putting plus signs. So it's saying, take this string of text, combine it with this variable, and then do this. And if you're familiar with PHP, you know that if you use double quotes in PHP, you could use a variable inside of those and it will parse it. But if you use single quotes, it won't. Now, JavaScript added something similar to this called template strings. So this is not a normal single quotation mark. It's actually your tick mark or your, not tilde, the asterisk. So we have these at the beginning of the end, and that allows us to, inside of here, put in a variable. And we use this mustache style of writing of you do a $, the curly braces, and then the variable name. And JavaScript knows, OK, all of this is going to be just regular text, but if I see the $sign with this, then this is going to be a normal variable, just like this would be. So this is important to notice, like we're using $sign in vanilla JavaScript. So this is not something that's a web API. This is part of the actual language itself. So if you're familiar with seeing jQuery before, you can't always assume that a $sign means jQuery. JavaScript now uses it internally, and other libraries can use the $sign as well. So you don't have to use template strings, but I just want to point out because they're super cool, because we don't want to have to write all of this when we could write this. And can't you agree something about this just looks cool, right? I don't know, curly braces around thing. That's like a design thing, right? Now we're designing beautiful code. Okay, so all of that together, well, this is the completed example anyway, so we know it works. But that's just going to display the clicks with that. Now, before we get into the WordPress REST API, I'm going to show you the next set of demos we do. So what we're going to do from here is next we're going to pull in data from the WordPress REST API. So all of these titles exist on a WordPress site somewhere. And then when I click on one, and they're loaded all via the API in JavaScript. And then when I click on one, I'm taken over to that WordPress site, and I can see that post. So this will be the first demo we do, which isn't great because we want to still see the content within here. So in the demo after that, we'll start off with the same thing, but then when we click into a post, it'll query that whole post and show us, and then we could go back, and we now have what's called a single page app inside of a single page in WordPress. So this is where we're going, but in order to do this, we have to talk a little bit about the WordPress REST API. So the WordPress REST API allows us to get, save, edit, and remove content from WordPress using JSON and JavaScript. JSON is something new we'll look at in a moment. But we're only going to focus today on the getting part. So the REST API can save, edit, and remove, but man, 3 hours would barely be enough if we knew all of JavaScript just to talk about how that functionality works. And luckily, most of the time in WordPress, when we're starting off using JavaScript and the REST API, all we want to do is get the data and display it in some cool interactive way. We're not really worrying about creating a front-end edit field with JavaScript and saving that data back, right? That's not usually a starting concern. So the WordPress REST API comes shipped in core now. So if you open up pretty much any updated WordPress site that does not purposefully have this disabled, and you add wp-json/wp/v2/ any of these endpoints, you will get data at the end of them. Now, some of them are protected. So you can't, for example, see all post revisions without being logged into WordPress and authenticated in some way. And you can't, for example, get all of the settings. Same with the users. So if I go to my site, if you go to javascriptforwp.com and you put / all of this, like there's 1,000+ users on that site, but you'll only see 1 or 2 displayed. So in the API, it's only showing users that have published blog posts or published content. So just the way you would expect to see an author archive, you wouldn't expect to see all your readers that have an account listed there, right? So that's how this is functioning here. There is also something else that could happen with the REST API, which is other developers like plugin or not theme authors so much, but plugin developers can create their own endpoints as well. So we may see something like this /custom/v1/ something else. So let's break this line up a little bit. The first thing we see is wp-json. And this is following the naming convention of wp-admin, right? You go to wp-admin to view the admin of your site. You go to wp-login to log into your site. We'll log into PHP, whatever. And then you go to wp-json to see a JSON representation. We still haven't mentioned what JSON is, but this representation of the site. After that, it begins the namespacing. So anything that starts with /wp is part of WordPress core. And then the next line over is the version number. Now what's weird is there was no version 1 of the REST API in WordPress core. It automatically started at version 2. And the reason has to do with the long history of the REST API starting off as a plugin and then being rewritten to a second version of the plugin that broke a lot of things, and then that second version of the plugin being dropped into WordPress core, and we're now using that in core, so that's why we had v2. There is no v3 on the radar at all, so do not worry yourselves about having to learn a new REST API anytime in the coming years, well, at least the next couple. However, this is a best practice in APIs where if v3 ever comes out, v2 should still continue to work. So if in our code we're saying, hey, go use version 2, and then v3 comes out, it hopefully shouldn't break everything. There was an example from a while ago of Twitter completely changing its API, and then everything that was using the Twitter API broke on the internet, which is a lot of stuff. So hopefully WordPress won't cause this to happen, right? It'll just use a new v3 when that comes out. Anybody could use that, and they continue to use the old one if they understand it. And in plugins, like the WooCommerce API is much further along than the internal WordPress one. So it might be on a later version, and then some plugins might be on their first version. So the v1, v2 will change. So let's say that we wanted to get all of the posts on our site with the API. We would go to this URL. What if we wanted to get just one post with an ID of 1 on our site? We would go to this URL. And in this structure is pretty much the entire WordPress REST API. It's a bunch of URLs that we could add an ID to the end of and get specific data back, and leave the ID off and get all the data back. So if we want to get all the pages, we do this. If we wanted to get a specific page, like let's say our About page, which has an ID of 5, what do you think you'd add to the end of that URL? /5, right? Now, we could also customize it. Has anybody ever used WP Query in WordPress? WP Query lets you write a custom post, and you could change like the order of things. You could limit how many things you could do. And every single variable or parameter that you have available in WP Query, you could also shove into a URL and change what you're getting back. So pretend that this is all one line, right? Like, couldn't make it big enough to show you. So let's say we have this URL, and then we add this to the end of it. What this is going to do is give us a maximum of 10 items back that have extra embedded content, match the search phrase hello world, and are ordered in ascending alphabetical order by their title. So this looks like a hot mess, but it's super powerful and flexible. To mention some things particularly here, like embed. What does embed do? And notice that embed is a little different. Notice you don't say embed is equal to true. You just do underscore embed. And this is following a particular, I forget the name, particular REST architecture of building things out. But when we do a normal request, when we get the author of that post, it's just going to tell us their ID. So we might get the author ID back and be like, 1, that's great, but I don't want to display 1. I want to display like this person's name. So if we do embed, then it's not just going to make a query to tell us what the author ID is, but it's going to give us all that author information. However, it's really important to start thinking about the expensiveness of queries when we get into stuff, because one of the main arguments you hear for working with JavaScript, besides the fact that it's interactive, is that it can be fast. True, JavaScript can be fast. It could also be crazy slow, and when you add API and AJAX requests into it, it could get even slower. So when we add embed, it's going to not just query the database, and if you pull up a post in a database, there's a field that tells you the author ID, right? So that's how we have that. But if we want to get the author name, we have to take that ID, do another query on the database, and get that data back. So every time we do embed, we're going to be running like 4 or 5 other queries on top of it. And the interesting thing about the WordPress REST API is almost every single shop I've talked to that uses it in production doesn't use any default endpoints. They write all their own custom endpoints. And we won't really get into that here on how to do that. It's in my course. It's not even in those 5 videos. But basically, I can create an endpoint that just gives the title, the date, and like a link. Right? It keeps it really simple, and then it's a less expensive query to write, and it's going to load faster. So don't think, oh, now that I got the API, I can just take everything, because that everything will slow down how long it takes for your site to load. So caveat there, but we can customize things, and this is a completely fair practice to do. So the practice we're going to do here, I'm going to kind of skip over it, but I'll just show you real quick what this would look like. So what you would do is pull up one of your local WordPress sites. So hopefully at this point you have local or desktop server installed, and you have a WordPress site locally, and you used FakerPress to create like 3 or 4 different blog posts. So what you would do now is go into your browser and go to wp-json and then / whatever that URL is, and try pulling up all your posts. So as an exercise, that's a pretty good thing to do. Then try pulling up one specific post, like put /ID, and then see if you could just access 3 posts. And the rest of these are all bonus, and maybe this is worth doing. So pull up now your local WordPress site, or you could go to any WordPress site. You could go to javascriptforwp.com and try this out. So try getting all the posts, just 1 post, and 3 posts. And you might want the slides to look at how to do that. So my site is example.dev. I'm doing a local site, and I'm going to do /wp-json/wp/v2/posts. Remember that plugin I told you about, the View JSON viewer one? If you don't have that installed, if you go to one of these URLs, this is what you're going to get back. And this is JSON, which is a way of formatting text so that it can be easily digitally transmitted. But this is not very readable. So the nice thing that this extension does is it knows anytime you visit a JSON page that it will parse it for you and give you this. Much nicer. So what we see here, if we go to /posts, are all of the posts. And I could toggle and close them up, or I could open them back up here. And notice that we have a bunch of information for each post. We've got its ID. We've got its slug. We've got the title.rendered. And this is something important to talk about in WordPress. Anytime we want to get the title and the content, we can't just say, give me the post.title. We have to say post.title.rendered. And the reason for this is because WordPress has a hook system. So anytime the title, you've used the title tag, right, or the content tag, anytime that's displayed on a site, behind the scenes, WordPress hooks in 5 different functions and let plugins and theme authors modify that title in some way if they want to. So when we get the data back from WordPress, we're getting the rendered or finally filtered. You could also call this filtered version of it. And if we are to authenticate with the API and we were to build like an admin editor, like a form where we could edit a post or a page, we would actually be able to get back title.raw. And that would be all of the initial content before any of the filters were run on it. So it's because of this filtering system and WordPress making modifications that some things have 2 versions of them. And when you're not authenticated, all you could get is the rendered final version. So we could see excerpt. And notice how author here, we just have 1, right? That's the ID, and then other stuff down there. OK. So this has an ID of 33. To get a single post, I'll just do /33, and now I've got just that single post in JSON format. I could also do something like per _page is equal to 3, and this should give me back just 3 results. Okay? Something we're not going to talk about here is HTTP. HTTP is the protocol for how all of this is working. So when we go to this URL, we're getting data back. What we're not going to explore here is HTTP is actually a 2-way street. So we're used to saying, go to a URL and give me data in return. But you can completely go to a URL and say, take this data and do something with it. So what we're going to do in our JavaScript is explore the first half of that. We're going to look at how can we make an HTTP request to a server with JavaScript and get data back from it. You won't be surprised to find out JavaScript can't do this. So what do we have to use? Another API. So now let's start talking about, and about the WordPress API, that's it. That's all we need to talk about. It's pretty simple. It's basically just how we could get anything in WordPress using a URL in that sort of format. But now we need to talk about how do we get the 2 of them communicating together. So we're going to talk about a technology that came out in early 90s, mid 90s, called Ajax, which basically allows us to get content from a server or send content to a server using JavaScript. And Ajax there are a couple different ways to do it now. Originally, there was only one, but it was never part of the JavaScript language. It was always an API that you could use to create this interaction. Now, specifically, when we talk about Ajax with the WordPress REST API, it's allowing us to get, save, edit, delete WordPress content using JavaScript and Json. So I want to distinguish between Ajax in general, which can get and set data from all, it could scrape a web page and get its HTML, it can ping a server and get something from a PHP file. In the WordPress environment, all we're doing is pinging a URL and getting JSON back or sending it JSON. So it's a more limited scope of what Ajax can do in its entirety. And there are a few different ways we can make Ajax calls. So this is a place where I would love to go into all the different types and talk about the differences between them, but I'll leave that to those extra videos that you could grab to do that and just talk about some core ones. So the original API that allowed Ajax to happen was called XML HTTP requests. And it's a terrifically named function that doesn't point out really everything it could do. So breaking this up into three parts: XML, HTTP, and requests. So it works with XML, but it'll also work with non-XML things. So that's why it's kind of a weird name. HTTP is valid. It's working, it's an HTTP library. So it's using anything that is accessed via HTTP, it can access. So if you have like FTP or a dev server or other things, it can't interact with those. But now requests is kind of misleading too, because technically requests in HTTP language does not just mean what we think it means. Normally we think of a request as like, I'm asking you for something, right? But technically requests in the Ajax world, you can make a request to give something as well. So the word request doesn't mean that I'm just waiting for something to come to me. It means that I'm going to make a request of you, and I could ask you to give me something, I could ask you to take something, I could ask you to take just a little of something, give me a little of something, and all of that. This is and has been an incredibly buggy implementation across browsers. So in order for this to work at the time when it was created across, well, it just didn't happen when it was first created. But over the years, there have been a lot of additions and libraries built up in order to try to make this easier to use and cross-browser accessible. So one of the main reasons that jQuery prototype and some of these other ones became so popular at the time they did was because there was no real way with JavaScript and just the API to get this to work without a whole lot of code. Nowadays, we have a new API being set up and a new standard called Fetch, which is a much cleaner approach and uses something called promise architecture. So again, neither of these are native JavaScript. They're both APIs that we could use. And I would be using Fetch today in everything we're doing, except it isn't supported in guess which browser? Yeah. So you have to create a polyfill, which is in programming speak, basically a bunch of code to get something to work as expected, even when there's no underlying architecture to get it to work that way. And most of the APIs, or most of the polyfills now, require you to know how to use NPM and Webpack, and that just adds like a whole new layer of complexity we don't need. So what we're going to look at today, and I'll say out of the two of these, I encourage you to go down the Fetch approach. Like I said, these videos, like go down Fetch. It will be the standard going forward, but the browser support needs a little help at the moment. You could totally launch stuff in production with it, though, if you have the right polyfill. So this brings up jQuery. One of the main reasons that people still use jQuery, because so much of what jQuery made easy was selecting elements in the DOM and doing stuff that didn't work easily cross browsers. What I showed you with Query Selector and what I showed you with the event object and passing in the word event into our click handlers, that nowadays takes care of what like 70% of jQuery was doing for people. So we could easily replace jQuery, 70% of it, with just vanilla JavaScript only because the only because the APIs and the browser engines and JavaScript language have evolved enough to allow us to do so, right? So that's not difficult. But to replace the jQuery Ajax functionality, because it's using this under the scenes, but it's doing everything possible to make it as usable in any browser, any instance. So there are a lot of folks who just use jQuery for the Ajax functionality. And in the example files, we're going to use jQuery. And I've downloaded a version of it that just has the Ajax. So I think normally jQuery is like several hundred kilobytes, but just the Ajax is 45 kilobytes. So you can compress that and only use the Ajax part of the jQuery library, which is what I'd recommend. However, most people, rather than doing that, have shifted to a library, Axios. So Axios is really big in the Vue community, and it basically, whereas jQuery is using XML HTTP requests, Axios is using fetch and promises. So it's using newer architecture, but it does a lot of the same things that jQuery does, which is make it easier to write and cross-browser workable. Then there's a whole subset of these, not a whole subset, there's two, that are meant just for making AJAX requests for WordPress REST APIs. Right, so remember I said AJAX is this really big thing that could do a whole lot of stuff, but in WordPress we're using a narrow scope of it. So there is actually a WordPress REST API AJAX library built into WordPress core, and it's built using Backbone and jQuery. And it is technically the officially recommended way to make WordPress REST API requests inside of themes and inside of plugins. And actually, this is the first workshop where I haven't taught those because it got to the point, like, has anybody feel overwhelmed yet today? Okay, so when I tell you that, like, if we tried to get into that, it's like, so it starts to overwhelm me, right? So like, you do need to, I used to say like, oh, you don't need to know any Backbone to use this. And then I realized, like, no, like, you really do need to understand Backbone to make sense of this. So I'd really like to end the workshop showing how we could do this with jQuery and then how we could do it in core the recommended way. But I've stopped doing that because I think that it's better to take the time to learn all the technology with that than to just jump straight in, because we could still use jQuery and it'll still work and it'll be a little bit easier. And then there's a decoupled environment. So if you want to build your own Node or JavaScript or Ruby or PHP app that's separate from WordPress, you can use this specific Node API client or JavaScript API client to interact with it. Now, all that said, all of this is JavaScript, but you could totally build a PHP app that uses REST API requests to build everything in it. So that's also possible as well. It doesn't have to be done just with JavaScript. So all that said, of all those things, we're just going to look at jQuery today, which makes me feel really sad because I'd love to show you all the other ones, but it really is the simplest and easiest approach and most versatile. So here's what's happening with an AJAX request. First, we say, here's the URL I want you to go to. Then we go to that URL. Then that URL gives us some data back in a JSON format. We take that JSON and we convert it into vanilla JavaScript, and then we use that vanilla JavaScript. So if we were using fetch or XHTML, HTTP, we'd have to manually write out all these steps. But when we use jQuery, we only have to do steps 1 and 5. Okay, so all of this is going to be happening behind the scenes. Here is what a pseudo AJAX request looks like. So go ahead and take a look at this for a moment. So I've simplified this quite a bit, but this is the actual AJAX part. Well, first of all, we've defined the URL. Then when we pass it into fetch, we're actually getting it, or we're making that request. And then it's being saved as JSON. Then we take our JSON, parse it into a normal JavaScript array, and then we could loop through that array and get out each post inside of it. So this is what the pseudo code looks like, and this is what the actual code looks like. So take a moment to look over this. So here we're specifying that we want to make a GET request as opposed to a post or update request or a delete request. We're passing in the URL. We could set our parameters, so if we want per page to be 3 and the order to be ascending or descending. And then we have this thing called success, which is taking whatever the data is back. So this first part is setting up the whole URL, and then all of that response is going to be passed back into here for us to use. And as this is happening, it's doing all of that JSON to vanilla JavaScript conversion for us. So when we access response here, it's just a nice, clean list of the stuff that we want, which if we took the time to show how to do this in vanilla JavaScript, you'd be, oh man, wow, that's so nice because it's like this much code to do the same thing. So what we're going to do now is we're basically going to do this, the two examples that I showed you, which are, at first, what we want to do Okay, so first what we want to do is we want to go over to our example site. So I have an example WordPress site set up at example.dev, wp-json, and we want to make a request for 3 posts. So we're going to go to our example site and grab this URL. And then back in our own JavaScript, notice that this is just a file here. So this, you can't see this, but this is just a file on a completely decoupled environment, and it's going to pull in those posts. And the first time we do this, when you click on one, it will go ahead and open it up on your WordPress site. Then the second time we go through and do this, when you click on one, it will make another request for the full content and allow us to toggle back and kind of view all of them in between. So let's look at the code here, and then I'm going to give you some time to play around with these. So we're in 2.1. Nope, we're in 2.2. And the first thing I'll point out is that notice I have linked up here jquery.ajax.min.js. So on the jQuery website, when you download jQuery, you could specify to only download certain sections of it. And I've checked just the Ajax box and turned everything else off. So it's a super small file. What you're going to go through and do is set up the same kind of stuff we've done before, the container object. So that is going to be ID main here. I'll just give you that. Then you want to put in the REST URL for your site, including wp-json/. So yours might not be example.dev. You could use a live site or another one. I'm introducing a new thing here called functions init. So it's very common in a JavaScript app to have the first function be called init or initialize and immediately evoke it. So by wrapping it in parentheses like I have here, it will automatically be called. This is the same thing as doing something like this. And I'm doing this for a reason, which we'll see in a moment. And inside of here, you call anything that you want to get set up. So we're going to be calling get posts. And inside of the get posts function is our Ajax request. You're going to have to change it to customize what URL you want. So remember, we set up our URL up here as a constant. And then down here, we want to go to our URL /wp-v2 posts. We want to get just 3 of them. And then we want to pass this response back in and render each individual post. The render post function should look very similar. It's the same stuff we've done before, so there's nothing there to add. So with this, again, see if you could set up the variables at the top, call get posts here, and then set up the Ajax request that you need. Again, to do this, you need a working JavaScript site, but if you don't, or a WordPress site, but if you don't have one, you could just use like WordCamp Seattle's will work fine. It'll give you those requests. So with your partner, go ahead and take a few minutes to try to work through that example. All right, I'm going to start coding out. Actually, I'll just, start this out. So I'm going to put in my example URL. I'm going to call get posts. And then inside of here, I will change these values to not just get the normal URL, but actually get the posts in it, only take 3 back. And then instead of having posts here, this is what we would normally call this, we're going to be using this response that we just got back. And then we will render each individual post. So that's pretty simple and straightforward. And I'll show you the next level up from here, which is the same stuff to get started. So I'll put in my URL there. Yours is going to be a little bit different. But then we have a bit more functionality in this one. First of all, we have a get posts function, and that will get all of our posts. So there's nothing to do here because we've already done it. But once we render all of our posts to the page, then we're going to run a query selector to get all of the links inside of h2 tags. So I'll use a query selector to h2a. And then for each of those links, we're going to add an event listener that calls getPost. So I want to talk about why this is important here. So remember how I said when you're working with events and things, the order of how you do stuff matters. So what's happening here is in memory, we get all of the posts back from our AJAX request. And then we're looping through those and we're displaying them all on the page using render post. But then what we want to happen in our app is when I click on one of those post titles, I want it to go make another request and do something with that data. So what we have to do is we have to take the content that we just added to the page, and then we have to attach new event listeners onto that content. So that's what we're doing here. We're saying render everything to the page, and then go through and link up and get all the stuff. Now remember, if I had put this line up higher in my code, it would have tried to get all of those links before they were ever added to the page. So this is where the order matters of needing to render stuff first, then go through and get all the links, and then we could add the event listeners. So if we had extracted this code and put it earlier up, then it never would have worked. Now what is getPost doing? GetPost is going into our event target and finding data set ID. So where did we get that? If we go down into our render post with link function, we can see that when we set up the anchor tag, we also set up an HTML attribute called data-ID, and we stuck our ID in there. So this is a really hacky method of, we knew that later on when I click on a post link, I need to find out what ID that is so that I could go to WordPress, query its REST API, and get the data back. There are more efficient ways to do this in JavaScript, but the crudest way is to just throw the ID into anything on the page so that if you target that and you click on it, you could read the HTML around it and say, hey, what's my ID? And then go make a request with that. So that's what we're doing here. Yeah, that's what we're doing here when we get a post. So we're saying, go to this, find the dataset ID, and that's going to be my ID. And then we're going to pass this into our AJAX request using the same URL we did before, but now adding on to it ID at the end. So what this will do is query for a specific post, and then once that's done, we have a function set up to render full post. And before that could happen, we're taking our container and clearing it out. Because if we didn't wipe the page each time, then we'd just have our list of posts, and then it would add new stuff on after that, and the page would just keep growing and growing and growing, right? So when we want to mimic page refreshes, we basically, the simplest way to do that is set inner HTML to 0. So let me pull up the completed example here again and talk about some problems with this. One of the problems when we drop this into WordPress is that we're going to have an issue with URLs. So because JavaScript is preventing every URL from having the default behavior, we never leave this page. We're always on the same page here. Hold on. It looks like the URL is changing, but it's really not. So one of the problems is like if I wanted to send somebody a link to this page, they would automatically always land in this version of it. So this introduces a concept of routing, which we don't have the time to get into today, but I do want to introduce a point of like when you start making really interactive experiences inside of JavaScript, keep in mind, or inside of WordPress, keep in mind that if you approach it a certain way, they're not going to be able to link to maybe a certain interactive behavior, like a pop-up is open and you want to send somebody just to that. They might be able to just hit the whole page and not see within it, because it's a whole nother level of complexity to write single-page applications in WordPress that also affect the URL and back and forth. Like this is like deep level of understanding of WordPress, because you have to start unhooking WordPress's entire permalink and redirect system and replacing it with your own, and all the fallbacks have to be in place for that. So just something to keep in mind. So my suggestion is like, if you want some interactive JavaScript, forsake trying to get some of the URLs to work and just build them something pretty and figure out that they'll figure it out once they get there. So we're pretty much coming to the end of this workshop now. We've only got a few minutes left, and we've talked about the WordPress REST API, and we've talked about a whole lot about JavaScript. And now in the last little bit here, I don't know if we'll get a chance to code all the examples out, but I want to show you how to take what we did and just drop it into WordPress. So the first thing is this process of enqueuing JavaScript. We can't just go into our footer and put our JavaScript. We have to use WordPress's hook system. And there are two hooks that we want to know about. WP enqueue script. Oh, those should not be functions. Sorry. These are hooks. OK. And WP localize. Has anybody ever used WP enqueue script? How about localize? Less common. So WP enqueue script looks like this. And if we had more time, I'd take more time to go over it. But basically, anytime we want to link to a JavaScript file, we have to give it a unique name. We have to create the link to it, which we use some WordPress-specific PHP to do that. We could set up dependencies. So WordPress ships with like jQuery, for instance. So we could just say, hey, make sure you load jQuery and the WordPress REST API stuff before mine. This is a hack because WordPress caches all CSS and JavaScript. And so if you're doing JavaScript development, you have to clear your cache every time you save your JavaScript file, which is a pain in the ass, right? So instead, we do a hack here and we say, use the down to the second timestamp as my version number. So every second that it loads, it's going to bust that cache and load your JavaScript. Never put this in production, but always use it in development. And then finally, a true or false value of whether you want your JavaScript to go in the header or the footer. The general best practice is put your JavaScript in the footer, because if your website is loading and it hits that JavaScript, it will freeze everything else from loading until your JavaScript fully loads. Then it'll go back and load the rest. So if we reverse that process, then we get to have our CSS and all of our HTML and our images load, and then the JavaScript will kick in at the bottom. When we're building sites with JavaScript, well, that's out of the question, right? Because it has to load JavaScript for it to load. But that's enqueue script. WP localize script is another hack that we have. And the origin of it was, let's say that we have translation happening in WordPress, which is hugely important, right? And there are all these tools in the PHP side of WordPress to say, hey, instead of saying click here, swap this out into whatever the local language is and display click here in that format, right? That exists in PHP. It doesn't exist in JavaScript. So WP localized script was created to allow you to take a bunch of data from PHP and dump it or inject it into a JavaScript file. And it was done with the intention of, hey, let's create string localization. Because let's say that you have a light box that you're creating with JavaScript and it pops open and you don't want to say close in English. You want to be able to have that translatable. Until we had WP localized script, there was no mechanics to do that. So while it was intended for that, what we do now is mostly just hack it to pass in WordPress data that has nothing to do with translation, but just PHP data that we want in our JavaScript side of things. So if you ever hit that point of like, man, how do I get something from WordPress into my JavaScript? This is the funnel to do it. And it works this way. First, we would set up all of our JavaScript, and then we would refer to that JavaScript there. So we'd say, OK, in this JavaScript file, create a new variable called whatever, and then pass it all this big array of data. So this is stuff that we could get from within WordPress, and then in our actual JavaScript file, see down here, main.js, we could refer to myglobalvars.siteURL, which we would never be able to do otherwise until we have this funnel of localized script, which can take PHP and pump it into JavaScript. So all that said, the first practice thing we would do is basically take a WordPress theme that does nothing except load a JavaScript file and make sure that it was all queued up. Because that's kind of simple and we're running out of time and you have the exercises and the completed, we're going to add this into the homework category, okay? So what you could do is grab in section 3, we've got these 2 folders, and these are actual themes. So you could just drop them into any WordPress site and activate them and then start playing around with it. But there's some important things to mention about jQuery and WordPress in closing that I want to mention. And first is that WordPress comes with, I think, like 35 different small libraries. Anybody ever use Masonry? Did you know it ships with WordPress core? What about Lightbox? You ever do a like something pop up over the screen? That JavaScript ships with WordPress core. React will be shipping with WordPress core in not too long, right? Backbone ships with WordPress core. There's a lot of different things that are shipping with WordPress core, and we have access to them. So jQuery is one of them. So without loading jQuery ourselves, we could say, make our theme dependent on jQuery, and it'll make sure that on the front end of the site, WordPress loads jQuery, and then your JavaScript after it. Now, I believe that we are in a time where you don't need to rely on jQuery, right? You could do 90% of it with vanilla JavaScript and be fine. And a lot of other frameworks, like if you're using React or Vue, it makes no sense to use jQuery along with it. So it's just like the tools don't fit together, right? But in WordPress, we live in this like really weird, super backwards compatibility bubble where jQuery is in almost everything in WordPress. So it brings up this question of like, if it's already loaded on the page, are you going to purposefully go out of your way to not use it? Like, I don't know if that's the best practice, right? Like I do just because I really like vanilla JavaScript, and you can. But I say in the WordPress environment, if it's already loaded, go ahead and use it and write jQuery. If it's not, then it's a consideration, right? If your theme or no plugin isn't loading it, then you can think about whether you want to or not. If you've used jQuery, anybody used jQuery in WordPress before? Are you familiar with what I'm about to show you here? You can't use the $sign in jQuery because WordPress used to also ship with Prototype, which was like a precursor to jQuery that also used the $sign. And as I mentioned, now the $sign is in native JavaScript as well. So WordPress does not assume that when it sees the $sign, it means jQuery. This is how jQuery is used in almost all of WordPress core. So they don't use the $sign. The $sign is a shortcut that jQuery allows you to use, but most of the time they literally write out jQuery instead of that $sign. If you want to use the $sign, you have to use what's called an immediately evoked function. Remember I showed you that init function earlier and it was wrapped up in a certain way? So the simplest function you could write in JavaScript is this. This basically, the first 2 parentheses is your function, and then the second 2 parentheses tells it to execute. So what are we doing in this? But we're basically, we're saying this section is my function, and this section is telling it to execute. So when I tell it to execute, I'm basically going to pass it in the word jQuery as a variable. It will then be passed into this function inside of a function, renamed to $sign, and then inside of here, we can now refer to it as $sign. So again, the process of this is it starts down here, we pass in jQuery, it gets passed into another function called $sign, and then we could use $sign within there safely, and it all immediately executes. This is often referred to as what? The no conflict wrapper for WordPress. So the next practice exercise then, we would basically take everything that we built before In our functions.php file, we'd load up the script, we'd localize it, and then we have this assets theme.js file. And inside here is almost the exact same code that we had before with our get post and get posts, and would display the page and create that single app experience. And all we would have to do is make this, instead of the URL being fixed, we could say this, which is referring to in the functions.php, this right here, and us grabbing this data from WordPress directly. The other thing I'll mention is that sometimes if you are building a JavaScript app within WordPress and you only want it to load on a certain page, you should wrap your WP and Q scripts inside of a conditional statement. So this JavaScript is only going to load if I'm using custom.php as my template. And this is really important, and I'd encourage you to be smart about thinking and not just loading JavaScript on every single page if it doesn't need to be there. Break your JavaScript up into stuff that's smaller, and then if there's something that is really big, like maybe you have on your contact page, you have an interactive map, but it's nowhere else on your site. Don't load that JavaScript everywhere else on your site because it's going to slow it down. So like I said, we're going to end in a place where we do have some homework that we could do. So at this point, the thing that I would consider homework is start playing around with what we were able to build using the REST API in JavaScript and put it into an actual theme. And the other thing I'll mention is that learning JavaScript takes a long time, and this process of going over this same material will happen 5, 6, 7, 10 times over the course of the next year or two. How many of you all have already learned some of these basics already? And how many of you still picked up new things about these basics today? Right? Exactly the point. This will continue to happen. This still happens to me as I'm doing this, right? So accept that process and don't mind it, and don't mind revisiting the same basics. And when Matt Mullenweg says learn JavaScript deeply, these inner mechanics, these things of how the event object works, of how you want to order things when you're building them out, of how the DOM is an API that's different from JavaScript, these are all things that are really essential to know. I'll do one last plug here. If you go to JavaScript for WP.com/WordCamp Seattle, you can sign up to get this drip campaign over the next couple of days. And I'd encourage this because what happens is we went through a lot today. Basically, your face was just like this with JavaScript in it. It's like, ah. And you need to give yourself time to decompress from that. But also, if you go back and watch these videos, it's going to be so much more significant in the coming week than it will a month later or a year later or a couple weeks later. If you're like, yeah, I'm going to go back and get into this. Like, no, you're probably not, right? Like, we have lives and we're busy. And as much as we love JavaScript, it's not always the highest priority. So I'd encourage you to just sign up for this, get those little bits and pieces as you go, and then go back and rewatch them like a month later if you don't get through all of them there. The other thing I'll plug is I do have this JavaScript for WordPress master course I've been working on. It is quite extensive, but out of every single, I took all the JavaScript courses, y'all. Like, give me an online learning site that taught JavaScript, and when I started this project, I did all of them, because I never wanted to teach JavaScript. I was just going to be like, go here and learn it, and then I'll teach you the WordPress stuff. But I couldn't find that one place that I could say, go here and learn it, so I decided to build it, and that was like a year and a half ago, and I'm still not done. But if you do want to learn JavaScript deeply, I'd encourage you to check out that course. I think it's a really good resource. But then after doing it for a year, I had 500 students, and 5 of them had completed. And I was like, oh dear, well, thanks for the money, y'all, but I feel bad that you're not getting through this. And the reason is because this is not a short-term process, right? Like, learning JavaScript is a multiple-year commitment. So I also started up a cohort program where I've been working one-on-one, like weekly Slack check-ins, video discussion groups, stuff like that. And the retention rate now, we only have 30% completing, but that's way better than 5 out of 500. So if you are in a position where you could afford to invest in learning JavaScript and want somebody to walk you through it and keep you moving along that path, then that plug is there as well. So besides that, please stay in touch, reach out. If you want to talk to me here, or if you want to ping me later with questions that you have about JavaScript, I'd love to stay in touch and hear about your successes. And I am sure today that, like, you came in with some things that weren't met. So maybe if you have questions about JavaScript that I didn't talk about, you could ask me that. Or if there are anything else related, I'd be happy to get into that. So thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure, and I hope that this was helpful for you all. Could you do me one favor? Can we all take a picture together? Can we come up here and then like take one together? Is that okay? For folks who are okay with that, por favor.